Okay, the doors are shut and everyone's situated, and so I'm going to go ahead and just break the computer. Well, that was interesting. Okay, I fixed it. I am Mike Nelson. I'm the president of the Chest Foundation, and I have the honor to do the introductories today. And so I have a little thing to read here for you that they've provided for me, and I'm going to do that. The award that Ms. King was given today is an award that was established in 1999 by two of our guests here, Dr. Evelyn Four and Dr. Alan Goldberg, and it honors their lifetime colleague and friend Margaret Pfrommer, a polio survivor and patient advocate. It's awarded to a clinician or ventilator-dependent professional or advocate who has advanced the areas of mechanical ventilation and fostered partnerships between physicians and patients. This year, it's my pleasure to present the award to Mrs. Audrey King. Let me show you the award. Pretty spiffy award. Okay. Audrey King, disabled by polio in 1952, has been a lifelong advocate for community living with patients with home mechanical ventilation. Decades of lived experience with iron lungs, cuirass ventilators, tracheostomies, and mask ventilation melded with her career as a healthcare professional has informed her personal wisdom and strategies for creating effective partnerships between patients and healthcare providers. As an internationally recognized speaker, writer, and advocate, she regularly supports ventilator patients and families, consults with healthcare professionals, and influences agencies and governments on program and policy issues that affect the lives of community living ventilator users. Although she's now retired as a psychologist after a 30-year career, Audrey continues to be involved in education, research, consultation, and advocacy. Mrs. King will now present her lecture, When Air Becomes Breath and a Life Worth Living. Please welcome Ms. King. Thank you.
Thank you very much. As a ventilator user and a retired psychologist, I'm very honored to receive this award. And in fact, I think in many ways that it's also a tribute to your specialty, because I'm still here after nearly 70 years. I know you're very curious, and you need to know a little bit of my history. So I got polio at the age of 9 during the last of the epidemic years. I spent 2 months in an iron lung, 2 years in hospital, seeing my parents for 2 hours on the weekend, and finally I went home at the age of 11. I went back to school at age 15, some 6 years later. There were no power wheelchairs until my last year of high school. So I managed with other kids pushing me around, pushing me from home to school, class to class, helping me with books, coats, and the school office staff took on the job of helping me with the washrooms, which wouldn't happen today, I'm sure. But then by age 16, I slipped into respiratory failure, and I found myself in the iron lung again. The cuirass enabled me to go home much more quickly this time. I don't know whether you're all familiar with the cuirass, but it was kind of like a mini iron lung, a chest shell negative pressure device, which allowed you to take breaths in and out. I was accepted at university, but only conditionally, I found out later. What was the point? She'll never get a job, the authorities debated. But thank goodness I never knew any of that till a few years into university, by which time I had proved myself. So I graduated, and then I was employed as a psychologist at a major children's rehabilitation center in Toronto. My responsibilities included assessment, planning, counseling for children with all kinds of disabilities, like cerebral palsy, spina bifida, head injuries, and so on. After 30 years of full-time employment, I retired to care for and coordinate the care of my aging mother, who lived with me and had dementia. This wasn't easy, but I can say that the shock value of seeing somebody in a wheelchair doing that did allow me to have my foot in the door with some of the agencies that I needed to involve. Over the years, I've learned a lot. I've survived major health issues, and I've enjoyed some amazingly improbable lifestyle adventures, which you'll hear about later. I've benefited enormously, obviously, over the years from the evolution of technology, from power wheelchairs, negative and pressure ventilators, non-invasive to invasive ventilation, and back to non-invasive again. But I'd say I've learned even more from the children and families I've worked with. I've learned resilience. I've learned, above all, I think, the insatiable drive to become who you're meant to be and what really matters in the face of challenges. And it's these insights I plan to share with you today. I'm going to focus on what makes a life valuable in spite of ventilator dependency. And I'm not going to talk about the acutely ill ventilated patient, because that is an area that you know so well from the areas in which you work. I'm going to share with you the perspective of long-term ventilator-dependent people whose strongest self-identity is their role and their value and purpose in life, not their dependence on the mechanical assistance that they need to breathe. This drive to be who you're meant to be plays out in many different ways, depending on where you're at in the journey of life and development. It can often override attention to necessary health issues. And I'm sure you've seen this in some of the patients you're involved with. I'm going to talk about some examples. I'm thinking of an embarrassed teenager who was discharged from a hospital with a cuirass following near-fatal hypercapnia. This teenager hated the cuirass with a passion. She feared the neighbors would find out. Her friends would discover her shameful, dark secret. She refused to take it home at first, resulting in readmission, a label of non-compliance, and being a difficult person, but then ultimately having to give in to using it. She was doing so well that after a few years, she never really believed it was needed. But then several years later, on a family vacation, the motor failed. And by the time the family came home, 2 days later, the truth was obvious. So there, during the teen years, identity and body image trumped breathing. Self-identity and what people think of you is huge during the teenage years. I'm thinking here of a 28-year-old mother with spinal muscular atrophy who was happily married and got pregnant, wanted to be pregnant with her child, really looking forward to being a mother. She had a very precarious pregnancy and nearly didn't make it due to respiratory failure. In this case, the drive of a young woman to become a mother can surpass awareness or worry about personal body functions. And then there's a highly respected professor again with spinal muscular atrophy, who just this past summer was invited to give a prestigious keynote speech in a major Canadian city, some 3,000 miles away from where she lived. Unbeknownst to those who invited her, she now had a G2. She was no longer able to drive her chair, and she was able to speak only a few short sentences before drawing another breath with her much needed mouth ventilation support. In this case, the insatiable drive of a mere mid-career person to deliver resulted in a pre-recorded video speech followed by a live coming in by Skype for questions and answers. Her delivery was smooth, thought-provoking, and of the quality expected. What the audience didn't know was that thanks to technology, her career ambition, and ingenuity, the speech had been pre-recorded in nearly 30 different segments that were absolutely seamlessly stitched together. She spoke for a while, then she took a breath, and then she carried on. What the audience also didn't know, and why should they, was that this was possible thanks to her ingenuity, technology, trust, and her relationship with an excellent pulmonary team. And then, of course, what can we say about the normal sexual curiosity and drive of a young man?
Not exactly a confession. I haven't yet done the deed.
I'm here for you, Mark.
Is it possible for me to know a woman in the biblical sense?
Are we talking about sexual intercourse?
I think so.
Outside marriage?
My penis speaks to me, Father Brendan. This therapist suggested I could work with a sex surrogate who would be sensitive to my unusual needs.
In my heart, I feel like he'll give you a free pass on this one. Go for it.
Yeah, maybe. Yes, it's good.
Hi, Mark O'Brien.
Your money's on the desk over there.
Yes, it is.
That was the wrong way to start off.
It really was. Shall we start again?
Please, you start.
I'm not a prostitute. You don't have to pay me up front. And there's a limit to the number of sessions we can have. The limit is 6. Shall we get undressed?
Sure.
First session. He was extremely nervous.
Let's forget about it.
Mark, do you want to see this woman or not?
No.
Oh, it's too late.
What floor?
18th floor.
What kind of therapist is she?
She's a sex therapist. Today they're working on simultaneous orgasm.
What's that?
You're going to start to listen to signals from your body. That way you'll be able to have some control.
Oh, God.
I understand even among non-believers, the most common expression of sexual ecstasy is, oh, God.
Picture yourself as a 6-year-old boy. Do you blame him for getting polio?
What is she like, Cheryl?
She's the most wonderful person on the planet.
I don't usually meet with clients outside of work.
We don't have to do much talking. I just want people to say, hey, who's that gimp with that beautiful blonde? What happens when people become attached to each other? Maybe this is a bad idea.
I think you've done a great thing.
He adores me, and I can get pretty kinky. Am I sharing too much, Father?
Go on.
So, you can see that the job of the patient is to get on with life, according to where he's at in the journey of life. The job of the physician or the healthcare team is to prescribe and monitor ventilators and to look after lung function. These are different roles, which don't always jive very well. Conflicts and misunderstandings can occur, resulting in lost opportunities for discussion, explaining, reducing fear, optimal management, and so on. So the patient's understanding of what's important can be quite different from that of the physician. And I think this diagram explains it pretty well. If you look at the first couple of categories, the degree of importance is big to the physician. But to the patient, what matters most is the categories at the bottom. His relationship, getting back with his family, getting back to his job, on with his education, and so on. So clearly, the need is to bridge these two realities, to get to the kind of relationship where you can get into discussion and collaboration in terms of what to do. I see it as a journey that's interactive, and it's as variable as individuals are. It takes time. It's usually sequential in nature, although, and it goes through the stages of dependence, apprenticeship, partnership, and expertise. In the beginning, patients and families who are new to long-term assisted ventilation are totally dependent on clinicians. They don't know anything. It's a whole new experience. But with time, health stability, and confidence, the patient can move on to an apprenticeship kind of mode. Here they need to learn what is important. They need to know how everything works, when to seek help, how to order supplies, and so on. With time, knowledge, experience, and growing confidence, the patient can then move into kind of a partnership mode where decisions are made by both the ventilator user and the physician in a collaborative kind of framework where there's discussion, questioning, debating, even arguing, sometimes repeatedly. The expertise phase is reached when years of living with mechanical ventilation equips the user with enough knowledge and experience to seek other options, to convince medical folk to listen, to believe, to discuss and respect the knowledge of the patient in terms of him or her own body. And that's not always easy. For example, I had just returned from a speaking tour in Japan, having decided, with the generous help of an RT friend who's here today, that it would be much easier to take a smaller ventilator that could hang on the back of my chair than the larger PLV 100. And in sending me up to use this, I discovered that positive pressure, something I'd never used before, was much, much more comfortable on the PLV, on the LTV 900, 950. So I went off on my trip, and when I came back, I had a sleep study that had been pre-scheduled. So I arrived with both ventilators, and I asked the technician to check me out on both. And she looked a little uncertain about what to do, and this was a little late at night when I arrived, so it wasn't easy for her to check with anybody. So I said to her something like, well, you've always said that you can figure out how a person is sleeping by only a few hours sleep. So I have the whole night ahead of me, and surely there's time to check me out on both. So she did, and both measured just as well. So I was able to switch. So that was an example of, I don't know whether it was, I guess it was partly partnership and partly being somewhat, well, certainly experienced. A more life-threatening example happened about 20 years ago now, when a serious bout with pneumonia followed by a complicated cholecystectomy necessitated invasive ventilation via a tracheostomy. After 18 months or so, I wanted the trach closed. I was now back home, and I was living with the consequences of being on a ventilator, although I've never really understood what being on a ventilator is like. I mean, are you sitting on it, standing on it, lying on it, leaning on it? I don't know, doesn't make sense to me, but people use the term. I knew I could have lived with that tube in my throat. Breathing was actually easier, but the home care support it necessitated was no fun at all. Lots of policies and regulations, not being able to get service when you needed it, and so on. So I wanted to go back to my previous mode if it was at all possible. So on my own initiative, I was corking the tracheostomy, and I was sleeping again with the nasal mask. It seemed to me that I could return to non-invasive ventilation, but I needed to know for sure, and I wanted to have the support of the experts behind me. But people said, physicians said, well, why? You'll only need it again. We can get your airway much quicker if you need it. So it was unnerving to kind of get no support, but I stuck to my guns. I was persistent, and I finally reached my trach-free goal, and that was 20 years ago now, and I haven't had a problem since. So I think that's an example of having kind of reached the expertise phase when the patient themselves knows enough to question, to ask, to keep on going with what they understand from living in the world, in the community, and the problems that there could be. When I was a child and a young adult, I honestly believed that doctors were God. I thought they were all powerful, to be honored and respected, never contradicted or questioned. And I felt confident and secure in this knowledge. My body, my breathing were the business of doctors, not mine. I had other things to do. I had to get on with my life. But as a teenager, I began to question, did I really need the cuirass? But now you've probably guessed that that was me, right? Yeah, I was that troubled teenager. So when I was a young adult, I came to Toronto, often considered the mecca of medical expertise, at least in Canada, and I decided to ask the question. The answer was shocking. I had quite a degree of scoliosis by then, and I was told not only did I indisputably need it, if I didn't get it, I would be dead in 3 years. But I was told, you probably won't survive the surgery. But if you do survive the surgery, you'll have a tracheostomy and you'll be permanently on a ventilator. But then the doctor went on, but even if you survive all these possibilities, you're going to be dead in 10 years anyway. 10 years at the most. Now that was about 50 years ago, so as you can see, I'm way past my best before due date, right? Still going. So what was my choice? I opted for the surgery. I woke in a panic. I couldn't speak. I pulled out the tube. Alarm bells went everywhere. Nobody had told me what to expect. I didn't know what this intubation was. Somehow, I managed to convince the doctor not to put it back. Have you ever tried, after 10 hours of surgery and a traumatic extubation, to argue convincingly not to put it back? But I did. But I could still see his blonde hair. I could still see his name tag. I think it was a Dr. Andrews. Many hours later, I awoke. My neck muscles were stiff as a board from the effort of breathing. And this time I pleaded for the cuirass. "You don't need it," he said. "You're doing fine. We're monitoring you." Now I had to convince him. Didn't he think it was really rather mean to do 10 hours of surgery and then take the cuirass away? Like, if they didn't think I needed it, why hadn't they weaned me off it before? So again, I guess I was an effective arguing person, because they gave me the cuirass back for maybe a couple of weeks or so, and then they gradually took it away. Psychologically dependent, the orthopedic guy said. You were just addicted to it. Now, I was a little embarrassed to be so psychologically weak, but I was also thrilled to think that I didn't have to deal with this big piece of equipment anymore. And I was really looking forward to when I got up and around, being able to do things and travel much more easily. 5 years later, I was in life-threatening respiratory failure. I don't know how I lasted 5 years, but I did. As I remember, I think my PaO2 levels were in the 50s and my PaCO2 was up in the 70s. The very same pulmonologist met me in Emerge or wherever it was and said to me, "What the hell were you thinking of? Why did you think you didn't need that?" And I just kind of sat there and I thought, blame the victim? I think that's what it's called. And it was at that point that I realized that if I wanted to survive, I needed to move beyond being dependent. I needed to ask questions. I needed to learn about breathing. I needed to learn about my lung function, my particular needs, and so on. And so I started the next stage into apprenticeship, into learning. Of course, the solution at that time was the cuirass again. But I didn't welcome it as a bed partner. For one thing, it didn't fit. Nobody knew about these things anymore. And even with padding and stuff like that, it still didn't fit. And it wasn't easy at all. I consulted with a lot of orthotists. I even mail-ordered one from the United States, and that didn't fit either. I felt like the very last polio respinaut in the world. But I knew I couldn't possibly be the last, so I just kept on searching. And then I came across a conference that was happening in the States. It was in 1981. It was called Whatever Happened to the Polio Patient. And this is where I met Dr. Goldberg. It was, let me see. My pages are stuck. Okay. I went, I saw lots of people who looked like me. There were lots of doctors there from all around the world, RTs, and so on. And what was amazing was that everybody was learning from each other, having lunch together, meeting in the lobbies, in each other's hotel rooms, long into the night. And I realized the incredible power when all the players in home mechanical ventilation got together, learning, sharing, so on. And here's Dr. Alba, another pioneer. She talked about glossopharyngeal breathing. She offered to teach anybody how to do it. I'd heard about it. I didn't know, so I took her up on the offer. And here's the results about 3 months later. I wish I'd learned that years ago. Many significant events grew out of that particular conference. The International Ventilator Users Network got established. And they put out a regular newsletter, which is a copy there. They have a resource directory, home ventilator guide, and many other things. And I would recommend that all of you introduce your patients to the IVAN network, because it's very powerful. Margaret Pfrommer was there with Dr. Goldberg's littlest patients. It was amazing. Some of us came back to Canada to form a group called Citizens in Living and Breathing. We were a grassroots group. We were a mix of parents, ventilator users. There was an OT who was involved, social worker, other advocates, and so on. During our 7 years' existence, we had several major educational conferences, and we invited speakers up, such as Dr. Goldberg, Dr. Doug McKim, Dr. Alba, and so on. All of them believers in the power of partnership and collaborative learning. We provided peer support to new ventilator users, and we were able to effect some very significant government changes. For example, we got housing opportunities for some ventilator-dependent people. And in Ontario, we have something called the Regulated Health Professionals Act, which means things like, acts, for example, that only nurses are allowed to do. So that, of course, had a big impact on people who need suctioning. But we were able to get an exemption to the Regulated Health Professionals Act for activities which are, quote, of a routine and stabilized nature. So, for example, if somebody needs suctioning every day, then a worker can be exempted from that. So that was a big breakthrough as well. So, essential knowledge about living with a ventilator comes from all of those great resources, but it also comes from just the experience of living life and taking risks. So, with my career established, with some money in the bank, with my ventilator needs sorted out, I decided it was time to go traveling. I was raised as an Army kid, so traveling was in my childhood. I wanted to do it again. The first trip was Barbados. But I discovered the very first night that cycle matters when it comes to electricity. So the ventilator started and stopped all night long. What was I going to do? Was I doomed to come home? But fortunately, my father had a retired Army friend who lived in Barbados and ran an illicit rum-making operation. So he let me borrow his generator for the week, and he went dry, and I was able to stay. So I learned electricity is more than watts and volts. The next trip was to England, canal boating on the Grand Union Canal. I'd taken all the necessary converters, transformers, adapters. I knew cycle was important. I thought I was well prepared, and I was very excited about it. My friend in England rented a generator, which you can see under the red umbrella in the back, because it rains in England. And from the generator, there was a cable that went along the side and through the window into where I was sleeping You can see the white square box was the old Monaghan ventilator. So I arrived in Gatwick safely, but I discovered my ventilator was on its way to Switzerland. Now, I had met Dr. Jeffrey Spencer at this 1981 conference, and he lent me a British version of the same ventilator. So that holiday was saved. And from then on, I insisted my ventilator stay with me in the airline cabin where I was. And as ventilators got smaller and smaller, of course, it became easier and easier to insist on this. So my ambition was getting bigger and bigger, and I had an opportunity to spend a week on a 100-year-old schooner in Amsterdam. Now, this boat went out into the North Sea, and they call it falling dry, which means the tide goes out, the boat settles on the bottom, and you're in the middle of nowhere. You're on the bottom of the sea, literally. And they would take you over the side, and you could walk around. Felt a bit like a moonscape. It was amazing. So I had written many letters checking on electricity, making sure I was going to be okay. I arrived to discover, yes, there's electricity, but it's only during the day. Because at night, they're generating more electricity with their generator. So what was I going to do? Anyway, the crew figured out, again, how to get a cable all the way through from the generator so I could breathe at night. So that trip was saved. Again. So that's my story in a nutshell. In getting my talk together today, I spoke to 5 or 6 other long-term ventilator users, and I asked them to share with me what they would like me to share with you in terms of what they think is really important that would make a real difference in the care and help you provide for them. It was very interesting because without exception, they all wanted me to share with you what they're doing with their lives, their value and their purpose. And what also surprised me, they wanted to be identified. I was going to give them all phony names, but no, they wanted you to know that they are real people. So there's Adolf Ratska in Sweden. He had polio when he was 12. He has done many, many things with his life, but he's mostly known for the Swedish Personal Assistance Act of 1994, which has saved the Swedish government over 13 billion euros as a viable alternative to transitional institutionalization and home health services. In other words, this is a program where the government gives the money directly to people with disabilities to hire the help that they need. Adolf says, I wouldn't call it wisdom, but most of us who've been living with equipment to compensate for underventilation become experts after a while in our own needs. We know what we want to do with our lives. All we need is the medical and technical expertise we might not possess ourselves for making the right adjustments to our lifestyle, for having the best equipment to support the lifestyles we aspire to. If I hadn't had the technical interest of friends and assistants, I might not have lived this long. With these adaptations for better quality of life, our group does need more help. Adolf and I first met again at that groundbreaking conference, but we've spoken together since at conferences in St. Louis, Munich, Germany, and most recently in Japan as the guests of the Japanese Ventilator Users Network. And then there's Katherine Frizzy, and you might have heard the name if you're from Canada. She's a professor of distinction who's retired now from Ryerson. She was Ontario's Human Rights Commissioner for a while. She's an officer of the Order of Canada, and she has 3 honorary degrees from different Canadian universities. She happens to be the distinguished career woman that I mentioned to you recently, who recently put together the keynote speech in so many different segments. She says, share knowledge, not just information. It is helpful to leave an appointment with test results, but what stands out is when it's given with knowledge and in context. A decline of 15% is discouraging, but I don't feel defeated when I learn that there's patients whose respiratory capacity is 0. That tells me that despite that, life is still livable. It's a challenge, not a defeat. It's still hope. Appreciate and respect the limits of your knowledge. When a patient asks if something will be possible, do not answer no. Give them more honest, not to my knowledge, but surprisingly favorable outcomes have followed with someone's hunch and a search. Then there's Justin Robinshaw, who is central nuclear myopathy. He's been invasively ventilated for about 7 years now, and he has a home business as a graphic designer. He says, asked me to tell you, the biggest barriers are not being straightforward. Having patients understanding, listening to patient issues matters a lot. My thoracic surgeon is always reachable. He has lots of patience and goes out of his way to solve my respiratory issues. I'm extremely lucky to have him. Then there's Ing Wong Ward, who was a well-known producer for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and is now an associate director of the Centre for Independent Living. She is the mother that I previously mentioned who had a precarious pregnancy. Presently, she's unfortunately battling a very complex colon cancer that's taking her through surgeries, radiation, and chemotherapy. And she was on the news this week because Ontario's premier invited her to a roundtable discussion with Bernie Sanders, who is here from the US, wanting to find out more about Canada's healthcare system. So it's quite an honor. She says, the bottom line message is there has to be strong two-way communication. There's real subtlety in everyone understanding one another. Doctors may need to take more time with people with disabilities to assess frustration versus depression versus suicidal tendencies if they're in that state. I get it that doctors need to focus on medical care, but medical care has to extend beyond blood tests and so on. Patients need to know how they can live. Often, their first point of contact to a new way of life is the doctor. A lot of these people have been quite preoccupied with the medical assistance in dying legislation. This is happening in many countries, has different names. Some long-term ventilator users, like Katherine Frizzy and Baroness Jane Campbell of Surbiton, who's a life peer and cross-bencher, in Britain's House of Lords and in the British Parliament are very concerned, and they're involved at the highest government levels. They feel a great responsibility. Here, the Baroness is talking in the House of Lords. Oops, let me go back. Nope.
My lords, I'm delighted to return to the chamber today after a long period of illness. I'm even more delighted that I'm accompanied by my assistant, a new, stronger voice who will enable me to continue contributing to debates in your lordship's house. And I want to thank your lordships for your understanding and for agreeing to this new and unique arrangement. This, my lords, is equality in action.
Here she's talking to the media further, but because of her mask, but because of her British accent, I feel like it's very handicapping trying to understand what she's saying. So I'm just going to read it first and then you can listen to it. She says, "We've heard the last 3 years about assisted dying, and people should have the choice to end their lives. People should have the choice to end their lives. If they become dependent, they don't want to live anymore because they can't do the things they used to. Do you really think that's reality? No, it isn't. Most disabled people are getting on with their lives. They're living their lives. They enjoy their lives. Why on earth can't we just be treated as normal members of the public? We have decent, ordinary lives. We have families. We have children. We don't think about dying all the time. And yet again, we have another film that's basically saying the same old thing. If you're in a wheelchair, you're tragic, you're brave. Go and make friends with disabled people. Enjoy the reality of their lives, not the crap which says it's tragic. I'm sorry, that's simply not the truth, and we're sick to death of it."
We've heard for the past 3 years about assisted dying, and people should have the choice to end their lives if they become dependent and they don't want to live anymore because they can't do the things they used to do. Do you really think that's reality? No, it isn't. Most disabled people are getting on with their lives, they're living their lives, and they enjoy their lives. Why on earth can we not just be treated as normal members of the public who have decent, ordinary lives? We have families, we have children. We don't think about dying all the time. And yet again, we have another film that is basically saying the same old thing. That if you're in a wheelchair, you're tragic, you're brave, and if you're not a Paralympian, then your life must be over.
The book sold millions of copies. Would you advise people not to go to see the film?
I would say go and make friends with disabled people and enjoy the reality of our lives, not the crap that says it's tragic and therefore the grace of God go I. I'm sorry, that simply is not the truth, and we're sick to death of it.
So I find that quite impressive that she's comfortable enough to go out with a mask. And there's another woman in San Francisco called Alice Wong who does the same thing, and her project is called Disability Visibility. You could look that up. But I think it's really great that many young people now, they have no hang-ups, going out looking like Darth Vader or whatever you want to call it. But people are concerned about the slippery slope they see in assisted dying. And I think this comment from an Australian newspaper sums up the reasons very well. The writer says it is a solution for the terminally ill, but it puts at risk vulnerable people. These would be people who have the capacity to understand that the drugs will kill them, but whose judgment is impaired by depression, like comes during severe illness, or mood disorders. People who aren't strong-minded or frightened are vulnerable. People who don't want to be a burden. People whose apparently voluntary request for suicide can be manipulated by the undue and influence, misrepresentation, or unconscionable conduct of others, including family members and caregivers. I have seen this happen with 3 people I know, friends and acquaintances, whose family members have written DNR in their record or indicated this to the doctors when they've been severely ill. And these people, in fact, lived a life that their family members didn't know about in terms of its value and so on. So this is a great concern. And people who do have used mechanical ventilation or are very disabled, they do have a sense of being lesser valued and devalued. And this is where the fear comes from. Ing, in her current struggle with cancer, says, as for doctor-assisted dying, my own experience is nobody has brought this up, even with my cancer. That's been a relief. I'm pleased that the focus has been on supporting my life. I'd also make the case that every person has biases. Some doctors and healthcare providers have friends or family or patients who are disabled, and they see them thriving. Others don't know anyone with disability living outside the medical realm. So their perceptions will, of course, be shaped by stereotypes or even medical training about disability. But we who are disabled know these stereotypes about our quality of life. That's why we fear the broader implications of medical assistance in dying. And it's this fear that has driven some ventilator users to become involved at the highest government levels in reacting against medically assisted suicide in groups such as Not Dead Yet. They see ventilator users as potential targets, especially during the resource cost cutting, during times of illness and vulnerability. Personally, no, I've already mentioned that I've seen people who have passed on who did not want to, but because of the lack of communication and awareness of family members, assumptions were made and this happened. So, there needs to be conversations, greater communication with family, friends, especially with physicians. In your role as pulmonologist, respirologist, it's interesting that your highly skilled expertise is taken for granted. It's just assumed. But it seems that communication and the relationship could be enhanced and would optimize care in order to get to that point of being able to talk about and make good decisions together. And it's interesting in that talking to these other people, I began to think about which chest physicians I had felt really mattered in my life. And then I asked myself, why is this? One of them, who I absolutely loved, said, I'm so proud of you. You've taught me all I know. Now that was a little disconcerting. Once he called me at home to ask if he could give my number to another patient who he felt was similar to me. And we became the best of friends. So the way we communicated to each other I felt admired. I felt respected. I felt that he really understood the consequences in my life of living with ventilator dependency. And another one, this is really interesting. I was in the ICU. I was very ill. I was sleeping, and then I kind of woke up. He thought I was still sleeping, and all he did was tuck the blanket up around my chin. And it just felt incredibly healing. Now, I don't know what that was. I think it was the art of medicine. I think the science is excellent, but maybe the art could be enhanced so as to get to that collaborative relationship that we need. So in summary, what makes for excellence in partnerships? I think it's greater awareness of the lives of ventilator users, their successes, their realities, what's important to them. And I hope I've shared some of this with you today. So I think if you have the time, the interest, the teamwork, whatever it takes to take patients through from dependency up to partnerships and getting some expertise in terms of their own condition. The third would be connecting patients to peers, to groups, to networks, such as the Ventilator Users Network, such as the Trach Mums of Louisiana, which I've just been reading about. Another one that I hear again and again is never extinguish hope. Hope is oxygen for the soul. It means putting things in context, listening, encouraging, supporting, and respecting. Advocate and work for and with mechanically ventilated patients and their families. Katherine Frizzy, again, sums it up very well. Never underestimate how influential you are as health professionals in crafting the narratives of our lives. This is an immense responsibility which goes well beyond the clinical and technical matters in which you're so capably schooled. Never stop trying to get better at deep and patient listening. It's your mightiest, it's your mightiest healing power. So at that point, thank you very much.
Would you like to take questions if they have some?
Yes.
Okay.
I think I've left a little time if you have any questions. Or
Questions, anyone? Okay. Well, again, Dr. King, thank you very much. Ms. King, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Oh, we do have a question. I'm sorry.
I really enjoyed your presentation, and it brought to mind the difference between curing and healing. So curing is something that we do with equipment and pills and injections and tests and things like that, and we very seldom accomplish, especially when we're dealing with chronic illnesses. And disease is what illness does to you when it takes away the ease of living. And then you're diseased. And there is no cure for that. You deal with disease with healing. You might cure illness, you heal disease. And the treatment for disease is given orally, but it enters the body through the ears. And it's a two-way street. As we try to heal our patients, the patients end up healing us.
Thank you.
I would just like to make one comment. I trained in pediatrics and in anesthesiology to become one of the early pediatric critical care physicians and was given the assignment of dealing with ventilator users of children. I didn't know what to do. And I'm standing next to Audrey as one of the people who taught me. I learned from some very few special physicians. We know who they are. They're members of the International Ventilators Users Network, and Dr. Alber is one of them. There are a few of us. We're a network, and we know each other. But truly, my education and understanding what you just said, which I think are more than pearls of wisdom, I think they are really divine inspiration, were taught to me by Margaret Pfrommer and Audrey King, who I met on the same day when we all met at that meeting. And to see this 30 years or 35 years later is simply the most wonderful experience of my life.
Thank you. I often think of a quote by Hippocrates. He said, "It's better to know the patient that has the disease than it is to know the disease that the patient has."